Good evening and welcome to 5-A-Day with Jay. I am your host, J.R. Murdock. How are you this evening? Thank you so much for joining me. I'm so glad you're here. The other day, I was talking about a million words of crap, and I kind of started talking about my writing journey back with my creative writing class way back in high school. So, how did I get to that, to writing novels? It's an easy linear no, I'm kidding. It's amazingly complex and all over the map, and lots of different side trails, false starts, and whatnot. When I was in high school, I loved writing. I loved collaborating. A friend of mine, Sean, and I would write stories. We'd write, each write a line or two lines. We would draw a picture to go with what we were doing. Had a blast just writing and telling stories. At the same time in high school, when I was doing the creative writing class, I was also playing Dungeons and Dragons, as many kids in the 80s did. And we created characters that our dungeon master loved to kill. What dungeon master doesn't love to kill off an entire party? That happens. It was fun. We would roll up new characters and try again. Eventually, we got to the point where we had a core group of characters that went on adventures, many adventures, and as I'm sure has happened to many dungeon masters, we didn't always follow the adventure. We didn't examine the clues. We didn't think about the clues that he thought were, oh my gosh, how could you guys completely miss this? We would find something, say a cache of weapons, like a crate full of spears, and be like, we would pack it up because we bought a cart, load it in the cart, haul the cart back to town, and sell the weapons. What does any of this have to do with writing? Well, those characters, we lived with them for a very long time. We played Dungeons & Dragons for almost a year with those characters. Moss, Willie, Slick, Reej, Dorg, Argmon. Not Argmon, Herman. Argmon is a completely different story from a completely different game called Bulldogs with Vic and Argmon. At any rate, our characters we built up over time. We went over to our friend's house on a Friday night and began playing Dungeons and Dragons and didn't go home until Sunday evening. We pretty much sat up eating Oreos, drinking Weiler's lemonade, and playing Dungeons and Dragons, occasionally crashing and falling asleep. When the dungeon master would sleep, those of us who were still awake were like, oh my gosh, I'm going to go do this to my character, and I'm going to go purchase this, and we would just crash. At any rate, those characters lived in my brain, and I always wanted to write more stories about them. Sean actually wrote the first story about Moss, who was a very short, ugly gnome, similar to the ending of, I believe it was The Hobbit, where he just disappears into the woods, one of the dwarves. He wrote a story about it. I'm like, wow, you can do that? We could write stories about these characters? Now, much later in life, I have read many people don't write about your Dungeons and Dragons characters because no one wants to hear about it. Then there's lit RPG. Now, I'm not a writer of lit RPG. I don't know anything about the genre. I don't know how the stories go. I have not read a lit RPG book. But back then, I wanted to write a Lord of the Rings type of story with the characters from our Dungeons & Dragons books. I had no intention of taking the adventures we went on or misadventures. All I did was I took the character names and the characters as they were and began spinning up a story, which wound up being of gnomes and dwarves. Even way back then. Actually, the first title I wanted to call it was Fantasy Adventure. Like, woo, that's a genre, not a title. I thought it was clever. It wasn't. So I had renamed it Of Gnomes and Dwarves. When I was in the Navy, I began handwriting Of Gnomes and Dwarves because I didn't have a computer, I didn't have a typewriter, I didn't have anything. And I would get 3-4 chapters in and be, oh, this is terrible. Throw it out. Start over. I would start again multiple times. While I was in the Navy, I probably started that book at least 10 times. just to try and get the story told, never finishing it. I struggled writing that one book for years. Then I got out of the Navy, and I continued to try writing it. Moved to San Diego, where I started collecting comic books. And I thought, you know what? Maybe this would work better as a comic. Let me try writing it as a comic book script and see where it goes from there. So I wrote the entire first novel as a comic book script, and at the time, one of my favorite comics was Cerebus. So my plan was always, I want to do like Cerebus. I want to have this be a 300-issue comic run, and boom, beginning, end, cap it off, and be done with it. 300 issues, every 15 issues would be a story arc. And I could rewrite them as novels. So I knew exactly how many books I wanted to write in the series. I knew in general where the entire story would go, and I knew the characters, and all the characters would have their own independent storylines along the way, even an entire book dedicated to just one character and an adventure that they would be on throughout the entire arc of the story, because I intended to split them up. Just that's how I wanted to write it. That's what I had thought about doing. I wrote the entire first book as a comic book script. I actually made it to the end. That was the first time I had finished writing anything of length since high school. It felt incredible. So I did another one. And then another one. I had 3 comic book scripts for basically 45 comics that I needed to find an artist for. And I knew an artist. The artist was incredible. He actually, when I met him, he was just submitting his work. He went on to draw the comic Warrior Nun Ariella. His name is Pete Woods. Great artist. He drew Warrior Nun Ariella. If you know it, that's now a TV show. That's his original artwork was what started it. And I remember I used to have his comics. Didn't get him signed because he had moved. But eventually he dropped that and he went to go work at Jim Lee Studios for a while. I actually got to go meet him at Jim Lee Studios, and I got to meet, well, I didn't meet Jim Lee, but I met a couple of the colorists, a couple of the writers, and I got to see, oh, his name is escaping me, but the artist for Gen 13. And I saw him actually in his room doing his pencils, doing his drawings. Incredible to go see the studio. Pete Wood went on to go draw for DC Comics. I know he did Catwoman. Yes, I'm not sure what he's doing now. I haven't followed his career that closely, but for a while I just, well, I wonder what he's doing. And I would go check up and say, wow, he's still out there doing what he loves. Awesome. And I had given him, let him read the scripts. And he's like, wow, this is good stuff. Yeah, I could totally draw this. And that's when he got the Warrior Nun Ariella gig, and off he went. I was, again, without an artist. So I had 3 sets ready to go. I let that sit and stew for a couple of years, changed jobs a couple of times, and eventually began working at Pacific Bell. When I worked at Pacific Bell, I would get sent away for training for a week. I still had these scripts in my hand that I wanted to convert to novels. That's what I wanted to do with them. I wanted to write them as actual books and get them done and move on. I still knew little about writing at the time, but I sat down and I wrote the first book. I went away on one of these training trips, came back, and I had started the book. I had my laptop, so every night in the room by myself with nothing to do, I was just type and write. Over the course of about a year, I wrote that first book, and it was terrible. I loved it because I had written it and I had finished it. I finished my first book. I was excited about it. This is 10 years after high school, and I finally wrote a book. Lots of false starts to get there, lots of edits, changes, modifications. When I had the first book done, I went through and I made revisions, rewrote, did it again. Over the course of about a year, I did that again and again and again. actually for about 3 years, I was rewriting that same book, and I just could not get it right, and I hated every iteration of it. But I had told the story, I had written the story. That's when I decided, okay, I need to just put book one aside. I'd submitted it to publishers, gotten rejected left and right. That happened. Then I decided to do the short story challenge that I talked about, where I wanted to write a short story every day like I can say his name, Ray Bradbury recommended. Ray Bradbury, in his book Zen and the Art of Writing, recommended sitting down and writing a short story every single day for a year. Doesn't matter how long, doesn't matter how short, write a short story every single day. I thought that's an amazing challenge. Let me give that a shot. I failed miserably. I only wrote 100 short stories over the course of that year. Still a huge, massive success. I learned a lot about writing, and I read a lot of short stories during that time to go, okay, let me get my brain into short stories. Then I changed jobs. I was still at Pacific Bell, but I had actually was SBC at the time. Again, I was sent off for a week of training. I left Sunday afternoon, checked into my hotel. Again, I'm sitting with nothing to do. I've got my laptop, and I'm like, you know what? I brought along all of the scripts for the second book, all of the scripts for the second comic book series, which was, again, 15 issues. I had all of them written, ready to go. I'm like, let's do this. And my plan was each comic would be one chapter. Okay, so I sat down and just started writing. I would go to my class in the morning. The class didn't start until 9 or 10. It started late. I was used to going to bed around 9 or 10 in the evening, up at 5 in the morning, get ready and go to work. That was my routine. So I would wake up early, boom, I'm ready to go. Well, I don't have to be anywhere for a couple of hours. I would just sit there and write. Had to bring the laptop to class because we needed to do stuff on the laptop in class. We have a lunch hour. Well, I brought my food. I didn't feel like going out to lunch. I got an hour for lunch. I sat there and wrote during lunch. Class would get out. I'd go eat dinner, go back to the room, call the missus, and write all night long. I did that for the entire week. During that week at that training class, I was so energized about writing, I wrote 60,000 words in 1 week. I know I'm capable of writing a large number of words in 1 week. I was there for 5 days. So I know once I'm in the flow of writing something, I can really crank out the words. I was excited. It was what I felt was some of the best writing I had done. I had finally put book one aside, moved on to book two, and everything I had learned over the course of the years of trying to write one book. The biggest thing I learned was putting it aside and working on the next book was huge. Over the next couple of months, I wound up writing the third book. I wrote 3 books in that series of Gnomes and Dwarves. All of them are terrible. It's early writing. That's what happens. I have long since rewritten that first book from scratch. I took the entire book, put it aside, I've got it in a folder somewhere, and I rewrote the entire book from scratch. And I'm now much happier with the second iteration. I need to go back and revisit it. I know it's not the best it can be, and I do plan on going back and revisiting that book. I may end up putting it aside and rewriting it again, because over the course of this time, I've forgotten much of what happens in the book. I'm going to reread it and see just how good or bad is it, but the characters remain. I know all of the characters in the book. I know the overarching plot of the first book, second book, third book, and I know where the entire series is going to go. Again, it was going to be a series of 20 books. It's a lot of books. That was always my plan, was that was going to be my fantasy, my epic fantasy, was going to be a 20-book set. That's what I'm thinking about right now, as I'm sitting down to work over the next 2 years of finishing off this 16-book collection of the V&A shipping universe. I know, spoiler alert, if you don't want to know what's going to happen, fast forward a little bit. I know at the end of this 16-book arc, I'm not going to wrap up in a tidy bow. There's going to be a lot. This is just the first arc of something even bigger that I've got churning around in my brain. I could easily do another 16-book arc. That might wrap up everything. That would be 8 books in each of the 4 series, which I think would be amazing. A 32-book set that is all one long story. Now remember, I'm not writing short books. I know a lot of authors who write a lot of books. They're writing 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 word books. No, some of these are over 100,000 words long. It's going to be a monstrous epic. That said, do I want to commit the time to working on those 32 books? Or do I want to get these first 16 done, then go work on the 20-book collection of Gnomes and Dwarves? Writer problems. Yes, I want to write all 52 of these books and put them out there. I know I want to write all of those books at a minimum. That's not counting also doing Billy Barbarian books, finishing off the Estelle series, which I believe will be a 5-book series once I get that completed. That doesn't include the Supernatural Learning series, which will be 18 to 20 books. Yes, those are far shorter, but still, that's a large number of books. That doesn't include all of the J-Bob books that I want to write, Rod Lance and the Bassist books. I've got a lot of books that I really do want to write and get out there. It's a matter of sitting down and doing it, and doing a book every other month. You can see my dilemma. That's a really long time and a lot of books. But if I can write all of those books, I keep saying, it's only going to get better. It took me probably 12 years of writing one book to figure out the only way I'm going to get better is to write the next book, which is what I did. At any rate, next time I'm going to talk about where writing for me went after that into the early aughties, because it was probably 1999 or 2000 when I finally finished Of Gnomes and Dwarves Book 1 and put it aside and worked on Book 2. It's an interesting career. I'd say career, but it's an interesting course of books that I wrote over this time. So I'll get back to that and we'll explain that. We'll talk about that next time. But anyway, I've been rambling for a very long time. I have been J.R. Murdock. You have been awesome. Until next time.